The ice didn't just break. It screamed. One moment, the world was a silent, silver masterpiece of winter stillness, and the next, it was a freezing trap of shattered glass and dark, suffocating water. Imagine the sheer, bone-chilling terror of feeling the solid ground vanish beneath your boots, replaced by a cold so intense it feels like 1,000 needles piercing your skin at once. Your lungs lock up, the air escapes in a frantic gasp, and as you reach for the surface, the jagged edges of the ice only push you deeper into the abyss. This is the story of a man who looked death in the eye in the middle of a frozen wasteland, and the complete stranger who decided that his own life was a price worth paying to pull him back from the brink. The morning air in the high peaks of the Lake District was crisp, sharp enough to sting the back of your throat with every breath. For Leo, this was exactly what he needed. He was 24, energetic, and perhaps a little too confident in his own ability to navigate the wilderness. He had been hiking since dawn, seeking the kind of solitude that only a harsh winter landscape can provide. The mountains were draped in a heavy, velvet blanket of snow, and the valleys were filled with a thick, rolling mist that made the world feel small and private. Leo loved the silence. He loved the way his boots crunched against the fresh powder, the only sound for miles around. He was heading toward a specific spot, a high-altitude lake known as Black Water Tarn, which was famous for freezing into a perfect, dark mirror during the coldest months of the year. Leo considered himself an experienced hiker, though in reality, he was more of an enthusiast who had never truly been tested by nature. He carried a decent pack, wore layers of high-quality wool and Gore-Tex, and had a thermos of hot coffee tucked into his side pocket. He felt invincible. As he climbed higher, the wind began to pick up, whistling through the craggy rock formations and tossing his hair. He didn't mind the wind, it made the adventure feel more real, more rugged. He reached the ridge overlooking the tarn just as the sun began to peek through the gray clouds, casting a pale, ghostly light over the ice. The lake was breathtaking. It sat in a natural bowl of rock, its surface a vast, flat expanse of gray-blue ice. From this distance, it looked solid enough to support a freight train. He descended the slope with a skip in his step, his heart light. He had seen photos of people skating on these lakes, and he wanted to experience that sensation of walking on water for himself. As he reached the shoreline, he paused for a second. The edges of the lake were cluttered with frozen reeds and jagged rocks, but the center was smooth and inviting. He poked the ice with his walking pole. It made a dull, heavy thud. To Leo, that sounded like safety. He took his first step, then another. The ice held. He began to walk further out, captivated by the way he could see deep into the dark depths beneath his feet. Huge bubbles were trapped in the frozen layers, looking like prehistoric jewels. He was about 50 yards from the shore when the atmosphere changed. The wind died down completely. The silence became heavy, almost expectant. Leo stopped, looking back toward the land. He felt a sudden, inexplicable prickle of unease on the back of his neck. He told himself it was just the cold, but deep down, a primal instinct was starting to wake up. He turned to head back, but as he shifted his weight, he heard it. It wasn't a loud noise, just a faint, musical ping that seemed to vibrate through the soles of his boots. He froze. Every muscle in his body tensed. He looked down and saw a hairline fracture beginning to spiderweb out from beneath his right heel. It was thin, almost invisible, but it was moving. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He knew he had to move slowly, to distribute his weight, but panic is a cruel master. Just as he took a tentative, trembling step forward, the ice didn't just crack, it disintegrated. With a sound like a gunshot, the surface gave way, and Leo was plunged into the heart of the winter. The transition from the world of air and light to the world of liquid ice was instantaneous and violent. The water hit him like a physical blow, knocking the breath entirely out of his body. He went under, the dark green water closing over his head, and for a terrifying moment, he couldn't tell which way was up. The cold was not just the temperature, it was an assault. It felt as though his blood had instantly turned to slush, and his muscles refused to obey his brain's desperate commands. Leo broke the surface, gasping for air, but the shock of the water made him hyperventilate. He flailed his arms, trying to grab onto the edges of the hole he had just made, but the ice was slick and fragile. Every time he tried to pull himself up, another large chunk would break off, sending him sliding back into the depths. His heavy winter clothing, which had kept him so warm on the trail, was now a lead weight, dragging him down. His boots felt like anchors. He tried to scream, but the sound that came out was a pathetic, strangled whimper. He was alone. He was miles from the nearest road, and the mist was beginning to settle back over the lake, hiding him from the rest of the world. 20 minutes away, a man named Thomas was making his own way up the trail. Thomas was older, in his late 50s, a man of few words and a lifetime of mountain experience. He wasn't hiking for fun. He was out checking on a set of weather sensors he maintained for a local university. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He knew these mountains were beautiful, but he also knew they were indifferent to human life. He carried a heavy pack filled with tools, a length of climbing rope, and a satellite phone. As he rounded the bend that led to Black Water Tarn, he stopped. He thought he heard something. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't a bird. It was a thin, high-pitched wail, the sound of a living creature in absolute agony. Thomas didn't hesitate. He dropped his heavy tool kit, keeping only his rope and his emergency kit, and began to run toward the lake. Back in the water, Leo was losing the battle. His fingers were white and numb, his grip on the ice edge slipping as his strength evaporated. He could no longer feel his legs. Hypothermia was setting in, bringing with it a strange, deadly lethargy. He felt tired, so incredibly tired. He thought about his mother, about the breakfast he'd eaten that morning, about all the things he had left undone. The water seemed to be whispering to him, telling him to just let go, that the shivering would stop if he just sank down into the quiet dark. His chin dipped below the water level. He closed his eyes, his mind beginning to drift into a hazy, painless fog. He didn't hear the crunch of boots on the snow or the heavy breathing of a man running for his life. Thomas reached the shore and saw the hole in the ice. He saw a tuft of brown hair and a pair of blue-gloved hands clinging weakly to the jagged rim. "Hold on!" Thomas roared, his voice booming across the frozen expanse. "Don't you dare let go! Look at me!" The sound of a human voice acted like a jolt of electricity to Leo's fading consciousness. He opened his eyes, squinting through the stinging spray. He saw a figure on the shore, a man in a bright orange jacket. Hope, sharp and painful, flared in his chest. But Thomas knew the danger. The ice between the shore and the hole was treacherous. If he ran out there, they would both end up in the water, and then they would both certainly die. He had to be smart. He had to be fast. He knelt down at the edge of the ice, testing the thickness. He could see the cracks radiating from the center. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a gamble with the Reaper. Thomas knew he couldn't walk to the hole. The surface was too compromised. He lay flat on his stomach, spreading his weight as much as possible, and began to crawl. The ice groaned beneath him, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through his entire ribcage. Every inch he gained felt like a mile. "Stay with me, son!" Thomas shouted, his face inches from the frozen surface. "Keep your eyes on me! Breathe! Just keep breathing!" Leo tried to respond, but his jaw was locked tight from the cold. He could only stare at the man crawling toward him, his vision blurring and clearing in rhythmic waves. The stranger was putting himself in the exact same position that had led to Leo's downfall. It was an act of pure, selfless bravery that Leo couldn't fully comprehend in his shattered state. As Thomas reached the halfway point, a massive crack snake-lined across the ice right in front of his face. He froze, holding his breath, waiting to see if the world would drop away. The ice held, but only just. He reached into his pack and pulled out the coil of rope. He didn't have enough leverage to pull Leo out while lying flat on his stomach, but he didn't have a choice. If he stood up, the ice would shatter. He tied a loop in the end of the rope with shaking fingers, the wind whipping around him, trying to steal his focus. "I'm going to throw the rope," Thomas called out. "You have to grab it. You have to loop it around your arms. Do you understand?" Leo nodded weakly, a tiny, jerky movement of his head. He didn't know if he could move his arms. They felt like blocks of wood, heavy and useless. Thomas threw the rope. The first time, it landed short, splashing into the water and sinking. He pulled it back, his own hands starting to lose their dexterity in the biting cold. He threw it again. This time, the loop landed right next to Leo's head. "Grab it!" Thomas screamed. Leo lunged for it, his numb fingers fumbling with the wet nylon. He missed. The rope started to slide away. Desperation gave him one final burst of adrenaline. He threw his upper body forward, catching the rope in the crook of his elbow and pulling it toward his chest. He managed to tangle his arms in the loop, locking them together. He couldn't grip it, but he was attached. "I've got it!" He tried to yell, but it came out as a raspy croak. Thomas felt the weight on the other end and began to back-crawl toward the shore, dragging Leo through the slush and the broken shards of ice. The process was agonizingly slow. Every time Thomas moved, the ice beneath him complained, shifting and dipping. He was dragging nearly 200 pounds of waterlogged man and gear across a surface that was barely an inch thick in places. His own muscles were screaming, his chest heaving as he fought for every centimeter. Leo was being dragged through the freezing water, the ice cutting into his chest and arms as he was pulled toward the solid ground. He felt like he was being shredded, but he didn't care. The shore was getting closer. The dark green of the lake was being replaced by the white of the snow-covered rocks. Just as they reached the edge, the ice finally gave way completely under Thomas's feet. He felt his legs drop into the freezing water, but he was close enough to grab a solid boulder on the bank. With a grunt of pure, primal effort, he hauled himself up and gave one final, massive heave on the rope, dragging Leo out of the water and onto the frozen mud of the shoreline. They lay there for a long time, two bodies heaving in the snow, the only sound the wind and their ragged breathing. Thomas was the first to move. He knew they weren't safe yet. Being out of the water was only half the battle. The cold would kill them just as surely on land if they didn't get warm. He crawled over to Leo, who was shivering so violently that his teeth were clicking together. Leo's skin was a terrifying shade of blue-gray, and his eyes were rolled back in his head. "Wake up!" Thomas said, slapping Leo's cheeks firmly. "You can't sleep yet. We have to move." Thomas stripped off his own dry outer jacket and wrapped it around the younger man. He reached into his pack and found a small emergency space blanket, the crinkly silver foil reflecting the dull light. He wrapped Leo in it, tucking the edges in to trap what little body heat remained. Thomas knew he couldn't carry Leo down the mountain. The terrain was too rough, and he was exhausted himself. He pulled out his satellite phone, his fingers fumbling with the buttons. He called for a mountain rescue, giving them their exact coordinates. The voice on the other end was calm and professional, promising a helicopter within 30 minutes, but 30 minutes felt like an eternity in these conditions. Thomas then turned his attention back to Leo. He began to rub Leo's arms and legs, trying to stimulate circulation. "My name is Thomas," he said, talking constantly to keep Leo conscious. "I've lived in these hills my whole life. I've seen fools like you go through the ice before, but usually, they don't have me around to pull them out. You're a lucky man, Leo. You're going to go home, and you're going to tell your family you love them." Leo looked up at the stranger. The fog in his mind was starting to lift, replaced by a searing, burning pain as the blood began to flow back into his extremities. It felt like his hands were being held in a fire. He wanted to scream, but he realized that the pain was a good sign. It meant he was still alive. He looked at Thomas, seeing the gray hair, the lined face, and the eyes that were filled with a fierce, protective determination. This man didn't know him. They had never met, and they likely never would have if it weren't for this accident. Yet Thomas had risked everything. He had crawled onto that ice knowing it could break. He had stayed in the wind and the snow, giving up his own warmth to keep a stranger from slipping away. The magnitude of the sacrifice began to sink in, and Leo felt a lump form in his throat that had nothing to do with the cold. "Thank you," Leo managed to whisper. The words felt small and inadequate against the backdrop of the mountain and the miracle that had just occurred. Thomas just nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon, watching for the flicker of rotor blades. "Don't thank me yet," Thomas replied softly. "Thank me when you're sitting in front of a fireplace with a hot drink in your hand. For now, just stay with me." They sat there huddled together, two lives joined by a thin nylon rope and a moment of pure terror. The silence of the mountain no longer felt peaceful to Leo, it felt heavy with the weight of what could have been. He looked back at the hole in the ice, a dark, ugly scar on the beautiful lake. It was a reminder of how thin the line is between a normal day and a final one. He realized then that he had been walking through life with a sense of entitlement, taking his safety for granted. That ended today. The sound of the helicopter appeared first as a low hum, vibrating through the ground before it could be heard in the air. Then, the bright yellow search and rescue aircraft crested the ridge, its blades kicking up a whirlwind of snow that stung their eyes. Within minutes, highly trained medics were on the ground, wrapping Leo in heated blankets and checking his vitals. They checked Thomas too, who insisted he was fine, though his hands were shaking uncontrollably. As they loaded Leo onto the stretcher to hoist him into the air, he reached out and grabbed Thomas's sleeve. He didn't have the words to express the depth of his gratitude, but his eyes said everything. Thomas simply placed a hand on Leo's shoulder and gave it a firm squeeze. "Go on now," Thomas said with a faint, tired smile. "And stay off the ice next time." Leo spent 3 days in the hospital. The doctors told him he was lucky to be alive, that another 5 minutes in that water would have caused permanent organ damage or heart failure. He suffered from moderate frostbite on his toes and fingers, but he would recover fully. During those days, as he stared at the sterile white walls of the ward, he couldn't stop thinking about Thomas. He reached out to the rescue team to get the man's contact information, wanting to do something, anything, to repay him. When he finally got Thomas on the phone a week later, the older man was humble, almost dismissive of his own heroism. He told Leo that anyone would have done the same, though Leo knew that wasn't true. Most people would have been too afraid. Most people would have called for help and waited, and by the time help arrived, Leo would have been a memory. This experience changed Leo fundamentally. The young man who had walked onto the ice that morning with a sense of invincibility was gone. In his place was someone who understood the fragility of life and the immense power of human connection. He stopped taking the small things for granted. He became more cautious, yes, but he also became more open. He started volunteering with the very mountain rescue team that had saved him, learning the skills needed to protect others from the same mistakes he had made. He and Thomas became unlikely friends, meeting once a year at the base of the trail, far away from the frozen lake, to share a meal and talk about the mountains. Thomas became a mentor to him, a living reminder that the greatest strength a person can possess isn't physical power or technical skill, but the willingness to act when someone else is in need. The story of the frozen lake nightmare became a legend in the local climbing community, but for Leo, it was a private lesson in the value of a second chance. He learned that nature is a force to be respected, never mastered, and that human kindness is the only thing capable of standing against its cold indifference. Every time he sees a frozen pond or a snow-capped peak, he doesn't feel fear. He feels a deep, quiet reverence. He knows that he is living on borrowed time, a gift given to him by a stranger who saw a life worth saving. And in every act of kindness he performs, in every hand he reaches out to help another, he pays back a little bit of the debt he owes to the man who crawled across the ice. Life can change in a heartbeat. One wrong step, one moment of overconfidence, and everything we know can be swept away by the cold reality of the world. But as Leo's story shows us, no matter how deep the water or how thin the ice, there is always hope as long as there are people willing to reach out a hand. Brave acts of kindness aren't just about saving lives. They are about reminding us that we are never truly alone. The next time you see someone struggling, remember that you might be the only thing standing between them and the abyss. Be the strength someone else needs today. Thank you for listening, and remember to stay safe out there. If you like the story, please show your love subscribing our channel.